We are not the newest lab in VBI, but close to it. We are in our 18th month. And also recognizing that we're the siesta panel for this meeting, we decided that we were going to turn this panel, its format and its content, over to our postdocs, who will come up now.
Hi, I'm Emily, and I'm here with Katie and Bianca, and as Sally mentioned, we are postdocs at SDAL, and we were asked to help put together today's presentations. And we thought we'd change things up a bit, and so we created a video to help introduce ourselves to you, and I hope you enjoy it. So please play.
Might want to turn the lights down in the front. Number 2.
Hi, I'm Katie Zemer. I'm a postdoc and a clinical psychologist. Welcome to SDAL.
Hi, I'm Bianca Pires. I'm also a postdoc and a computational social scientist here at SDAL. But given that most of VBI is out in Blacksburg, we thought it'd be fun to give you a little tour of our lab here in Arlington.
Hi, I'm Emily Malfino. I am also a postdoc here at SDAL. I'm a clinical scientist. Come along with us on a tour.
Describe SDAL in 5 words.
Katie, that's easy. It's fearless, fun, and forward-leaning.
Okay, Sally, so if you could come up with a metaphor for SDAL, the SDAL team, what would it be?
Well, I actually have 2. The first is data sleuthing, and the second is unconstrained model adaptation. And so let me unpack these for you a little bit. So in SDAL, we just are all about the data. We have no fear in ferreting out all sorts of data, sources of data that others wouldn't even imagine would be applicable to the research question at hand. We're unconstrained in our thinking about modeling approaches, and we draw on all the disciplines across our lab and across VBI as we approach our research. You could say what we're doing is putting transdisciplinary team science in action.
So Sally, what is your vision for the lab 5 years from now?
My vision for the lab 5 years from now is really a vision for Virginia Tech and the National Capital Region. I would like to see the National Capital Region of Virginia Tech be the urban analytics hub for the DC metro areas. And SDAL needs to be a significant driver to reach that goal. I want SDAL, our people, and their research to be central to the global conversation on the development of theory and methods for and the appropriate use of all data to improve society, from industrial innovation to health and social wellness of communities.
Stephanie, what's been your most memorable moment in SDAL?
We've had many memorable moments, but probably one of the most that I remember was in the fall of 2013, and we were a brand new lab, and we had all the executives from Arlington County come and talk to us. We had the police chief there, we had the fire chief there, we had the chief information officer, we had all the executives across Arlington. So we introduced our lab, and they got very, very excited. They wanted to immediately start working with us, and they started asking questions. They wanted to know about mapping the age of Arlington, and they wanted to know about the most frequent flyers out of their 911 calls. And they also wanted to know about greenhouse gas emissions from the county buildings. And so we were all excited, and everybody left on a high note. But after we left, I was like, oh my goodness, we've promised all this work, and we're a lab of 3.
Dave, describe your research in 1 sentence.
It's developing statistical methods to try to combine various different sources of data with different computational models so that we can use those models to make inferences and predictions in places where we just haven't seen them before.
So Dave, tell me, what type of projects do you see the lab working on in 5 years?
So in 5 years, I think we'll be much better at integrating the different talents and abilities that we have here at the lab. And I think we want to attack problems that needs all of us together to be working on these sorts of problems. So one of the areas I think would be looking at communities and how all the different interactions within a community, healthcare, parenting, childhood health and obesity, putting all this stuff together to figure out how can we make communities healthier would be a problem that I'd love to be working on in 5 years from now, and I think we have the talent and the skills here to be able to do that.
What's the most interesting thing you've learned since being at SDAL?
Well, because I had to think about this one. Because SDAL mixes people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of disciplinary backgrounds. We all have been learning to overcome a lot of our prejudices. For me in particular, I have learned that not all banjo music is bad music.
Describe your research in one sentence.
In one sentence, privacy-protected federated data linkage.
What's the role of data science in SDAL?
Data science is really foundational to everything that we do at SDAL, as it is to any top analytics shop. Science is the systematic exploration of phenomena in the world, right? Where we're trying to explain and predict things. Well, we do that by observing things. We make observations. Well, today, these observations are taking the form of, in many cases, huge sets of data that have been collected for reasons other than the scientific endeavor that we're working on. Being able to take that data and systematically analyze it, clean it, and transform it to a state that can be used by our psychologists, our economists, our, sure, even somebody else, our statisticians, to answer society's questions. That's a very foundational aspect.
Describe your research in one sentence.
Research aims to study societal problems within the framework of social and economic networks by developing theoretical models, by conducting simulations to illustrate the differences between different models and their assumptions, by validating these models, collecting existing and traditional data sources in addition to the novel data sources, and by designing experiments.
What's been the most memorable moment at SDAL?
It was one of my first days in the building. I was in my office working, and I was hearing a lot of people walking in front of my office. We have a seminar room down the hall, and I saw that there were a lot of people formally dressed, and they were walking. They had some walkie-talkies, they had ear gadgets, and it looked like Men in Black. I heard that there was a governor visiting. Then I understood that I was actually in the capital region, not in Blacksburg anymore.
So Mark, describe your research in one sentence.
So my research is really figuring out how to apply psychology to big data sciences, really. I mean, so psychology fits in a lot of different ways, but I think it's an underutilized area. So there's a set of theories and methods that psychologists are really into and use and are really good at, but they're not really integrated into the big data framework at this point. And psychologists, actually, on the other side, they don't really think about big data at the same time. So there's room for not just understanding social issues using large unstructured data and psychological theory, but there's also room to test psychological theory in new ways using new kinds of data. So it goes both ways.
So what's the most interesting thing you've learned since being at SDAL?
That's easy. So this is the first time I've been around a lot of computer scientists who aren't psychologists, because there is actually a historical interplay between computer science and psychology proper. But what I've realized is there's a whole field of computer science approaches related to understanding, for example, sentiment of populations and natural language processing that doesn't really think much about psychology. They use psychological concepts. They don't use the actual theoretical concepts that the psychologists use. So the disconnect between the two, if you want to call it that, or I don't know what you call it, but it goes like this, basically. And it's on both sides. So that was actually very surprising to me.
So Mark, what do you do to relax in between all the grant writing and research at SDAL?
Well, I'd say it this way. How do I not lose my mind? It's like this. There, now I feel better.
All right, and now I'd like to introduce Mark Orr and Dave Higdon, who will be talking about quantification and uncertainty quantification from their respective disciplines of psychology and statistics.
All right, Katie, thank you. I guess it's me first because my one sentence was just a sentence, but as you saw, Mark, his sentence might go on a long time, so we thought, all right, I'll talk first and talk about a few things. Then we'll move on. I'm Dave Higdon, statistician, way in over my head on all these socio-biological sorts of systems that we're looking at. So my world, I just came from Los Alamos, like lots of people in the session before. And my experience is pretty much with physical systems and combining models from these big computational models from these big physical systems, putting them together with data in sorts of ways to come up with ways to make predictions and inferences with these sorts of things. And so this was just a collection of experience I've had with different types of models, different data sets that I've worked with over the time. And if I look at all of them, they don't sound a lot alike what we heard so far today. So I'll talk a little bit about my hope for where these interactions might be. And Mark will also, I'm working with Mark some to try to figure out where are these connections that we can make that maybe don't do so much of this, a little more connecting and figuring out where can my experience and expertise and ideas come into interplay with dealing with big sociological and biological systems. So lots of experience in physical sorts of systems. All right, I'm going to wander anyway, but if you look at material science over there, I'll see if I can point. Yes, I can. So, what happens here? The more detailed modeling you sort of get for something like this, the more you fill that thing up with atoms that have rules about how they're going to behave with one another. And so at first you thought this material might be something lattice-like, iron, something like that. But now you've filled it with all these actors that are iron atoms playing with each other, and they interact with each other. And so now all these atoms don't really have this it's not really iron anymore. It's a bunch of things interplaying, and you don't think that all these atoms are really like the one piece of iron you're going to crush or do something or shock or something like that. But you're hoping that when we put all this stuff together, the macro properties of this material are going to match what really happens in the laboratory. And so much like the social or biological systems that we're talking about, these sort of things are hopefully going to happen when we talk about combining rules that are social or biological in nature, and we want the macro ideas or concepts to work out when we're making predictions. So, okay, a lot of different ideas for what I'm talking about. I thought I might just talk about one from my experience. So, so here we have the universe evolving from up at the top there. Big Bang happens. Over time, you get a little bit of variation in the density of the universe, but because gravity's acting, sorts of things like that. Over time, enough things come together that stars form and start emitting energy. And then about 14, 15 billion years later, you see what we see now. So turns out I work with cosmologists that simulate this system. So here we are, a bunch of particles, dark matter starting out, maybe with variations that are very consistent with what we see in the cosmic microwave background. It evolves over time, and then we evolve this thing until we have a universe that we think ought to look something like the one that we have now. So I know we were worrying about sample sizes earlier today. And so this thing, yeah, there's just a sample size of 1, so it's not as much as you might like. Not all statisticians are going to be happy with that, but I'm good. I'll work with it. And I think the philosophy is, well, how are we going to overcome that? We're going to use lots of principles in modeling that we do know about. We know a lot about the universe. We know that over time, it's going to evolve according to rules that have to do with energy and gravity. So things will coalesce, and you'll see a universe that looks a lot like what we got today. But we don't know everything about how to put in the rules for this simulation. For instance, the makeup of the universe is something that we don't really know exactly. So we can put in things like dark matter, a certain amount of dark matter, a certain amount of baryonic matter. That's the stuff that we're made out of. Mysterious dark energy, let's put a lot of that in there. And the question is, well, how do we sort of make up our universe and maybe add a few extra things like the Hubble constant or the rate of expansion of the universe? And what setting do we need for all these things to make a universe that when we compare it 14 billion years later to the one we see now, it looks like it? And so this is one of the inferences that we try to make. What's the makeup, or what are the parameters of this model that give us a universe that looks like what we're seeing now? All right, so that's one of the statistical questions, is parameter estimation. And it's hard because we have a sample size of 1. It's also hard because these computational models take, maybe a month to run or maybe even more than that. It's also hard because they're not getting everything right in the physics. You try to get the rules you think you know right, the ones that are going to be important to what we're going to look at, but you don't have all the rules encoded in there. And so because of that, you want to be able to quantify your uncertainties. You want to estimate what these parameters might be, but not just sort of the best setting. You want to say, what are plausible settings? What might we see? And so then when we make predictions about the universe, another few billion years down the road, we'll have a big spread of uncertainty because we don't have everything quantified exactly right. We have things known up to, give or take a few standard deviations here. And so this will give us our predictive uncertainty. So this basic principle, we are very hopeful, is also going to work with different types of models. And so even though these physical models have really hard rules encoded into them, they hate it if I try to suggest, oh, you know what, if we put in a different value for the acceleration due to gravity, your model would do a lot better. For some reason, they don't like that. But there's all these physical rules here. Some of them have parameters that you're allowed to adjust. Some of them don't. But they're really special there, and I don't really like that much. They're special rules. I mean, often they're called laws, right? You're not even allowed to break these things. You've got to follow these rules exactly. I think in other sorts of domains, we don't know these rules as well. In fact, we don't know if we have them all. And there's a lot more flexibility in what are the parameterizations or how we describe those. And I think this extra flexibility might actually be good for combining data with these large system models to make inferences, because one of the things that's hard with these sorts of models is they're fairly rigid, meaning that if we put in what the data allow, we try to constrain to the data, they don't necessarily do exactly what nature says we ought to do. So that makes it hard. So there's an example of just one system we might model. There's another system, but I'm certainly not going to talk about that. But I'll tell you one thing. It's about putting atomic nuclei together, so protons and neutrons together, and that's hard. I was really proud of myself. We worked on this thing, and now we have predictions about what might be stable configurations of nuclei down the road. And then I learned today that trillions of cells we have in our body, and so how many nucleuses do we have in our body? Probably a lot more than that. Oh yeah, that's a much bigger system. That could be a lot harder. So like I said, in the statistical estimation, that we'll combine models with data, we'll estimate parameters, we'll make predictions with these models, knowing that they're not perfect, and come up and estimate uncertainties for these sorts of predictions. So that's my world, and Mark's going to come up and talk about his world, and then we're going to try to figure out where we might do our future work after that. Mark, come on up.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'm a psychologist. I'll just say that up front so you know. And if you don't like that, you can leave. No, I'm just kidding. So just one question, Dave. You should keep in mind that you probably had the same observation, but I was wondering what the policy implications are about predicting 3 billion years in the future for the universe.
Has been validated with one model.
One model, right? Okay. So anyway, so the point of today's talk is really to contrast Dave's approach, what he knows, and what I know, what I'm trying to do, because we're both trying to work together to do the same thing in the future. So try to keep in your mind what he just told you, and then contrast it with this. There's a similarity here to what Dave was talking about with the universe, which is if you're thinking about something like health behavior, so I could have a public health background, and some outcome like smoking cigarettes or not, and you think about the whole system that might impact that. This is an approach we use in public health called the macro-social approach. And if you think about all of this, one of the issues you have, and the same with MDSSL, is we only have one run of this system. If you look at the United States, the last 50 years, it only ran once. So just keep that in mind. But we like to conceptualize this as a set of variables and what I call a large-scale sociobiological system. So if you're focusing on something like health behavior, what impacts health behavior? So very broadly, local environments, which could be advertisements that you might see. You walk into a store, there's a bunch of cigarettes. It might be the people you hang out with. Well, that would fall under social and cultural norms. So just think of, the way we think of this stuff, and the way my approach of thinking about individuals' behavior at the individual level is to think about, the easiest way to think about it is when you wake up during the day and you go to work, and after you go to work, you go home, you might stop by the pub, or I would anyway, and you come home and you hang out with you might watch TV for a while, and then you go to sleep, and you do this over and over and over, and then in our country, 300 million people do this, and it's a global thing, so we have billions of people doing this every day. This is trying to capture a set of variables at different levels of analysis that impact each person's decision to smoke a cigarette or not the next day, if you think of it in those terms. And the reason, so just to back up, so we have socioeconomic, political, industrial, environmental, social, and cultural norms, and health behavior and outcomes. You can see the arrows go different ways. That's just to represent that your behaviors might affect policies, and policies might affect your behaviors in the long run. So the reason I show this graphic is this is really just an organizing framework, but it really tries to, how do I go forward? Tries to capture, this is a representation of some of the work that MDSSL does that you just saw. So I'm not going to describe it in too much detail because I think they did a much better job than I could ever do. But this is one way you might think of representing these kind of processes, right? So, and what makes it really interesting to me is the next steps and some of the stuff. That's part of the reason I came to SDAL as a psychologist. I'm interested in taking, does anybody know what this is? Brain. So this is a picture from the Human Connectome Project. So NIH is funded since 2010, a large-scale approach. They want to know not just what parts of the brain are associated with what functions, but they're trying to map out all of the connections in the brain. So it's basically a large network analysis of the brain. And it's really interesting because you can also link that to behavior, and we know a lot about the brain from neurophysiological studies from the past, but this is an unprecedented view of all the connections in the brain. So it's almost like this, but it's just within one person. So you can imagine everything here, but we have to deal with this too at the same time at some level, right? And the easy way to think about it, this is how I think about it, because I do computational models of health behavior. So I think of the fact that I can think of a single person as a cognitive system using an artificial neural network or something like that. And I know that people affect each other. So for example, your attitudes about abortion, if you and I talked, it might change my attitudes about abortion if they were different. If they were the same, it might actually bolster my attitudes towards abortion or something like that. So I think of cognitive systems as individual people, and the output of my system actually is the input to your system to some degree, and the output of your system is the input to my system, blah, blah, blah. And this system, the reason we think of what we're trying to do is think of this and the macrosocial approach in these terms, building up from the individual, a set of behaviors, using cognitive systems, cognitive science, and neurophysiology, building up and scaling up to social networks, and eventually scaling up to something like you saw. I should have put somewhere in here, I could have put a globe right here, right? I mean, that's where we're headed to some degree. So I just wanted to put the perspective of the sociobiological system. Really, what we've left out here is we've went from the physical systems to these kind of social systems. There's a lot of biology in the talks earlier today, especially. That really kind of fits in here, and this is trying to capture all of that together. And the issue that Dave and I are going to talk about now is when I build these models, and I've done some of this kind of work, this is work in progress, really. Some of this kind of work, but at a really basic level. And I do work like this, but it's much more abstract than the work that they're doing in DSSL, looking at these kinds of questions. The uncertainty that we have in the models, and we don't know how to deal with it. The work I've done, we don't actually address the question at all. So what we're here to talk about today with Dave is how would we think about doing what he's done with physical systems and understanding the uncertainty of these kind of systems. So with that, we just have a set of initial questions that we were going to talk about, and then we want to open it up to you guys. So Dave, you want to come up and?
Oh yeah, Warren.
Why don't you come? Yeah, why don't you stay over there?
All right, I got it.
Okay, good. So this is just, I'll just start, because this is, I kind of see this as me asking Dave for help, because I have these systems that I build, and the parameters, you know, for example, so I have a large set of unknown parameters, and some of them are misspecified, and some of them aren't known, they're not there. And the way I approach it is I just tell everybody what I don't know, and I tell them the parameters that I'm setting, and I hope that they buy into it. And we do sensitivity analysis, but that's not really what I'm talking about, because the sensitivity analysis I do is with the parameters that I know, you know, and that's kind of, I'm just wondering, what are your comments on that idea?
All right, yeah. So, all right, great. And this is unrehearsed, so this is really going to be fresh. Hopefully, no one brought any food in to throw. So starting with any sort of system that has a big involved model attached to it, I think that the starter questions are, all right, well, what data are available to inform this sort of thing, and what types of questions do you want to be able to address with this model? And so getting at those, the hope is that some of the questions kind of separate pieces of the model out and say, are there certain features of the model that you can attack first without necessarily having to get all the right features of the other components of the model, you know, nailed down, so that if we can kind of dissect the model a little bit and attack it in pieces, I'll feel like, okay, if we can get these sorts of things, we know we have data sources that inform different pieces of the model. We know that there's coupling, but it's not super strong between these components. Then I'll feel more comfortable with the fact that given the data that we do have, we might be able to start constraining this thing and getting this model to look a little more like reality.
Okay, let me ask you a question. So if I go, I'll just give you an example. I'm going to go back to this thing here. So one of the models I've just published recently, I have something kind of like this. It's school quality, right? So I know a little bit about school quality. And imagine I built this agent-based model of, it's like 64 neighborhoods. It's supposed to represent the United States. I'm looking at disparities in education and how that affects health behavior. So I have a couple papers that we've pulled from the education literature that tell us, and economics literature that tell us about changes in school quality. And it's basically a regression of coefficient that I put into my model. And it's part of my behavior. So if I'm in a school with a certain school quality, then the next year I either have a higher chance of smoking or less. And that's all I know about it. And there's a bunch of other parameters in there. So does that map onto any kind of problem you've dealt with?
It's big and it's loose, right? That
right.
Like we talked about the materials.
Let me add one thing. The data, I'll never get the data.
Let's go. We can not even n equals 1, huh? There won't be outcomes about, we know this many students began to smoke in this school or that many for that school or anything like that?
So maybe the data could, I would have to convince someone. I think Madoff said it, well, who said it? Once we have the money, you know, we can get whatever we want. So.
All right, so what's the goal of doing this experiment, this model?
Is to understand the relationship between socioeconomic disparities that pattern with or correlated with racial, ethnic differences in the United States, and how that affects behaviors in health and cardiovascular disease.
So linkages between these sorts of things and
right.
smoking
And we have,
behavior.
Yeah. So we have, part of the issue is we're trying to look at what-if scenarios. So that's why we built the agent-based model.
All right. Anyone can ask questions now, because now I'm stumped.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure.
That's
I
good.
think.
I think now's a good time to move into
You want to move? Okay.
group questions.
All right.
You guys are
I had just one more thing before we go ahead and sit down.
Okay.
Before we go into that, let me just. I think we had one more thing here. Is it the arrow?
forward arrow, backward arrow.
Okay, so I just had one thing I wanted to share before we move into the Q&A. Now that you've seen a little bit about the lab and met a couple of our characters in the lab, and that really highlights the different kinds of disciplines we're coming together. What I wanted to do was just circle back a little bit about how interested we are in collaborating with VBI writ large and collaborating with all our colleagues across Virginia Tech. And we've started down that path a little bit, and I wanted to share an example that where we're collaborating with NDSSL and hopefully stretching ourselves in what we're trying to do, as well as stretching NDSSL and how they're thinking about some of their models. And this starts with a problem with some colleagues in Houston on air quality. That's Houston on a good day, maybe not. That's Houston on a bad day. There's been some great research that our colleagues have done that have demonstrated that localized concentration on a 3-hour window of air quality increases the risk of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest by 4.4%. It's a huge result because nearly 400,000 people in this country have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and 90% die. So that's a serious issue. Now, what they can't do is to actually try to understand what's the populations at risk here. They only can do this based on knowing who had the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and attaching to them their exposure to the air quality in this localized time period. So they came and asked, well, the tools of NDSSL, could they possibly be used to help us understand that question, coupled with some of the data sources that we may want to be adding to those tools to generate different kinds of days and different kinds of normative behavior. So that's led us to actually coupling a couple things. And the first is building off of the synthetic information platform that NDSSL has for the Houston area, where the whole population gets built out, the 4.4 million people at their 1.8 million locations. And the beauty of this is that we know where those synthetic entities are at every moment of the day, which means that if we take an air quality model and try to attach it to this, we can actually get to the point where we can trace individuals. That top graph is tracing a family, each of the individuals in the family throughout 24 hours of the day, what their ozone exposure is. And the reason this is really important is, just like our colleagues said earlier, and as our colleagues said here, that this individual behavior matters. Because if I just average this, all of the effect washes out. The middle picture shows one of the Ship Channel neighborhoods in Houston, and the total exposure of the individuals that live in that area according to our synthetic model integration. What you see, there's a lot of variability because people don't stay put, they don't stay home, they move around the city and they get exposed during the course of the day to whatever those values are. So I love this example. It's one of our first forays into really working together, where now we're going to be able to figure out how do we add a lot more health effects, a lot more other behaviors into this to be able to look at and look for health effects and what social disparities and other attributes come into play, which will feed into policy. So that's us, and we're really happy to be here, and now we'll answer questions.
Check.
So part of it is just more like a, well, okay, I can cast this as a question. So this thing that and Madhav talked about, the within the skin constellation, the large data analytics piece and the continuation of questions you ask when you ask about health effects, for example, obviously goes into organization of health-related data, ultimately biologically referenced data, and the data analytics is going to be quite extensive. I mean, so you focus today on the social aspects of it, the behavioral aspects of it, and putting it together, but when you get to the place just where you're going to stick these things together, ultimately you're going to connect, to these other things. And I just, so the question is, it seems to me that would be true. So one question is, I guess, is that how you see this going? So my question is this, so when I look at, what we saw on this side, the Patrick style project, when I look at the synthetic information platforms, when I look at the kind of information that are generated for things like work patterns and cardiac problems or any number of other things, across VBI, across all these things, there seems to be some sort of central data analytics role here for the managing this collaborative bringing together of things. So of course we need sponsors and we need to do those things, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we might think about coordinating those kinds of problems, the basic collection and integration of the information we generate across this entire spectrum of work. That's really what this lab is kind of about. I mean, I know you say social on there, but it's a data analytics laboratory, and that's the full scope of what our problem is. And I just sort of like to see what you think of as a vision for you guys in that sort of setting.
Sally, we're going to make you go first.
You're going to make me go first. Okay, so what we see, what's interesting is we did I didn't show it, we did a little word analysis based on everything that we've written in the first 18 months of the lab. And the big central word, and it's on our poster that you'll see tonight, is data. And so it's the data analytics and the data piece, and really wanting to pull the data in, whether it's traditionally designed collections, administrative data, administrative records, digital data, or the really important massive amounts of generated data. So what I see as an organizing principle for that is going to be through much of what we saw with Patrick. Imagine data portals like Patrick in many different of the problem domains and relative to many of the different sponsors. And the tools like we saw for NDSSL, that these get incorporated in these portals so that we have access to that both as researchers and also our sponsors have access to that. So I think that we need to drive towards an organizing principle that actually allows that kind of access through a portal science type of paradigm. And one of the things that I was really struck with, and I've been struck with every time I see Patrick, for example, and I think it's the RNA rocket, where it goes through some detailed analysis of understanding data quality and sort of the representativeness of this information, and add on to that the possible use scenarios of it. And that needs to underpin all of what we're doing here and all of the tools and portals that we develop. So that's how I see it, and I think that SDAL can be incredibly good collaborators on sort of rounding this out.
Can I add one thing? Is this one? Check. There's a quote by Phil Zuckerman. Theory without data is myth, and data without theory is madness. And the reason I say that is because the social part, a lot of the work that the substantive areas we're interested in, the theory part is essential as part of the data analytics. Otherwise, you're just driving data into nothing. That's how I see it.
And I'll add that looking wider, sort of VBI wide, right? And all right, we have social things that we want to focus on, but I think within VBI, in a larger kind of system, that how to combine data and models and make predictions is kind of universal theme there. And I think that our experience on that meta level with one type of model ought to carry over in large part to working with other types of models and applications. So I think from my perspective, that's a big lever for me coming here and what I would like to do. So yeah, I think that's definitely a very relevant point there.
And just one other thing, I mean, the theme that hasn't been brought up explicitly today is the information biology of going from molecules to policy. I guess it was reflected in NDSSL's talk. And so I think that SDAL helps anchor VBI on the societies and population end of that spectrum. But I am very excited for how we do figure out how to go from below the skin to above the skin to policy. And I think that we'll add some capability there.
I didn't realize that you folks felt your talks were in the siesta session. We were actually thinking the same, and we were planning a flash crowd Bollywood dance at the end. But we didn't have to do that.
There's still time.
No, but that was the prediction question I was going to ask Dave. Could you have predicted would we not do it or not? So I have a two-part question. One is, I think people have said that, in general, garbage in and then garbage out. I want to sort of change that thing a little bit, given the amount of data that we produce. My conjecture is that, if you have a lot of data where most of it is garbage, and then this small bit of good piece, like we talked about junk DNA, or we talked about these things that Skip talked about, then I think it's actually useful data, and I wanted to see what statisticians felt. And a second part of the story is we have been very interested in procedural data, not just typical data that folks have worked with. And I think that's a very important class of data. Chris has talked about it many times. As a computer scientist, I feel procedural data is actually the data in many ways. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure thing. So I think that this separating the data that you really need for what you're after versus the data that you don't need is huge, right? And this is where I think models are very, very important for that. That a lot of understanding what the model responds to and what it doesn't respond to tells you a lot about what the data you're going to need are versus what you maybe won't really need so much. Oh, there's another point that was sitting in there. Yeah. And I had no answer for the procedural part just yet. But that said, I think this opportunity of looking at a lot of different application areas, different types of models, different types of data, will help us form that sort of thing. And I don't think we're there yet on the procedural part, but I think that's important.
Well, and I think that the procedural data piece is new compared to most groups that are working with it, and I think it's exciting to see how we're going to be able to make use of that, because I think it might actually get us to the point where some of the computation can be reduced and some of the uncertainty can even be reduced by using the procedural forms of data, versus counting cars through intersections. Use the fact that you know how a light operates. So, but that's new. That's very new to be bringing, statistical scientists and quantitative social scientists into thinking about data in that way. So we're here.
Yep, great. Thank you so much for a very nice video and great presentation. We really appreciate it.